Don't tell me there's nothing to do in St. Louis tonight at 7 o'clock. St. Louis County Library on Lindbergh. One of my favorite things to do is go and listen to authors who come and talk about their book. And the county library is great at bringing in great authors and great stories. Today is no exception. Tonight, 7 p.m., St. Louis County Library. Vanessa Gezari is going to be here. She is a Washington Post reporter. She was also New York Republic Slate. She lives in New York. We won't hold that against her. She has written a book which is getting a lot of attention. It's called The Tender Soldier, a true story of war and sacrifice. Vanessa, thanks for traveling and thanks for coming in.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
This story starts the day President Barack Obama is sworn in.
The day, actually, that Barack Obama was elected, November 4th, okay. 2008.
All right. What happens?
So in southern Afghanistan on that day, 3 civilians were out with a U.S. Army patrol in a very difficult part of Afghanistan where there hadn't been American troops for quite a long time. And they went out there, and these civilians were part of an experimental Army project that it embeds social scientists with the military to help them understand local people in Iraq and Afghanistan, try to help the military understand culture in those places. Anyway, these civilians were out there that day, and they were interviewing folks in the market there, try to get the lay of the land. And one of them, brilliant young woman named Paula Lloyd, was talking to a man and for about half an hour, and suddenly he threw gas on her and lit her on fire, and that's where the story starts. So it's one act of violence that was very unexpected, and the book kind of dissects it and looks at why this happened.
The book is called The Tender Soldier, a true story of war and sacrifice. Take us back to this program. Was this the first of its kind, the first time they've ever done anything like this?
It was the first time in just about 30 years that the military, and particularly the Army, had done something this big, this ambitious, to try to address something that's a real problem for the military, which is that we go into these places, and most of the time we're sending young soldiers, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, who don't speak the languages. They haven't been trained. They haven't been educated about these cultures. Now, to be fair, what soldiers are trained to do is to close with and destroy the enemy. They're not trained to get to know people, to strike up conversations, to understand cultural nuances. But this has caused us a lot of problems in Iraq and Afghanistan.
They're not nation builders is the buzzword.
That's correct.
Right? I mean, that's President Bush came into office saying, I'm not going to nation build, and then proceeded for the next 8 years to try and build 2 nations.
Absolutely right.
And so part of the where we are nation builders was this program to help build the nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing President Bush figured out was that, you may say you don't want to do that. And in fact, we may not want to do that. There are a lot of good reasons why perhaps we shouldn't do that. But when we get into a place like Afghanistan, it very quickly becomes clear that a lot of the violence that's happening there is not driven by ideology. It's not driven by this hatred that people have necessarily against Americans. A lot of it's driven by poverty, by social problems, by arguments that people have between themselves, between tribes. When you start to address those problems, that's when you get into a difficult area of nation building.
Also self-preservation, right? I mean, these farmers, they just want to survive, and they'll lie, cheat, or steal to whoever they have to survive and keep their family safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to put it that way, I think that I tend to think of them as storytellers rather than liars, but it's absolutely true what you say. This is about staying alive in a dangerous place.
Yeah. How did you come across this story?
So I had been covering Afghanistan on and off since 2002. I went there first as a young freelancer. I actually left the U.S. to freelance in India on September 10th, 2001. So I got caught up in the midst of a war that I didn't expect to be covering. Ended up spending the next 3 years in and out of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and living in that region. When I started reporting this story, it was many years later. This program wasn't actually developed until 2006, 2007. It didn't send its first team into the field until 2007. So I went back and started writing about it in 2008. because I had seen early on in the war the kinds of mistakes that soldiers were making. I mean, we're talking about young soldiers going out having to negotiate with village elders, and they were, these guys meant well, but nobody had taught them anything about this place. They didn't know the history. They didn't know who they were dealing with. And, the Afghans really played us a lot of times. And, they used, especially in those early years of the war and continuing, they used American firepower to defeat their own enemies. And that created tons of problems for us.
Some people say they're still using us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that what you said before is right. These are people who need to stay alive. That's their focus. I mean, when you've lived in a war-torn country for 30 years, you do what you have to do to stay alive.
So the soldiers aren't trained to the nuanced ways of the world that they're being sent to. But is it true that these civilians aren't trained in the military techniques they need to survive the place they're being sent to?
You mean the civilians who are in the human terrain program? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was a big problem that I saw when I went out and spent time with these teams. So some of these folks, I mean, a good example is, the woman I write about in the book who I mentioned, Paula Lloyd, who was attacked that day. She actually had been in the Army. So some of these people did have military experience. But what I found was that there were very few people like her who had the perfect set of experiences. I mean, she had a master's degree. She had been a soldier. She had been spending, years in Afghanistan doing development work for USAID and other organizations. But, the mix of qualifications that you have to do this job well, what this program was trying to achieve, is so unique and so rare, really, that it's not just that you have to be a PhD anthropologist who speaks the Afghan languages. But, yeah, you also have to, know how to live on a military base, know how to go out with soldiers.
She was the one from Wellesley.
That's correct.
Which is an all-woman school, a liberal arts college in Boston.
Great school.
Tremendous school. My sister, a graduate in 1980. Hillary Clinton was a graduate.
That's right.
The Secretary of State from Budapest was from there. Her name's escaping me. Madeleine Albright. She was a Wellesley girl. So it's interesting that this Wellesley girl has this military background and is injected into Afghanistan. I'm not too sure too many Wellesley women you find in the outback of Afghanistan. That's
absolutely true. And it was one of the things when I was reporting the book. I mean, everybody said, God, it's so rare for a Wellesley woman to join the military. I mean, this is not, these are women who are trained to go out and lead in the world, but usually in public policy. A lot of them go into diplomacy, as you mentioned. And that really was what Paula Lloyd ended up doing. But on the way to that, she took a very interesting path. I mean, she's a fascinating character. And I think one of the reasons I enjoyed writing this book, and one of the things I think readers will, I hope take away from it, is that, this is a story full of fascinating people whose lives take turns that you wouldn't expect. And so folks might be surprised by some of the people in this book.
Is the book just over this story, or is it about the whole program in and of itself?
It's about the whole program, but it uses this one story of what happened that day and deconstructing that and how we got to that point as a jumping off place and as a narrative frame throughout the whole story. So the characters, the teammates who were out with Paula Lloyd that day, the soldiers who were out with her background, that's all woven through the story of the history of this program and how it came to be.
The program, how does the troops handle the civilians and the civilians handle the troops? Is there a turf war? Is there egos involved? Or does it work actually quite nicely?
You mean actually when they're out with the soldiers?
Yeah.
It depends. A lot of soldiers who I met when I was out spending time with these teams and with military units around Afghanistan, they were really grateful to have these guys because a lot of them knew that they didn't really get the context that they were operating in. There were some who thought that, what are these eggheads coming out? These guys don't know they don't know what kind of world soldiers live in. I mean, soldiers live with seeing their buddies get killed every day. And that makes you not want to be nice and chat up some guy about, well, how's your wheat crop going? That soldiers aren't, once you've had lost a friend or two in battle, that gets old real fast.
Right.
So this was
you could see the rub.
Absolutely.
But you can also see why the military leaders are like, no, we've got to put these people on the ground.
Yeah, that's right. And General Petraeus was a big supporter of this program. This program was really a part of the rise of counterinsurgency, what we saw in Iraq during the surge in 2006, 2007, and what we saw in Afghanistan in 2009, 2010.
Was it successful, and is the military still doing it?
The program?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think ultimately that it has been very successful in Afghanistan, but I think what it's done is it's convinced people who make decisions in the military and in policy that that this is something we need to pay attention to. I hope that it's convinced them of that. I mean, one thing that we're really worried about, some of us who care about this right now, is that we've got these sequester budget cuts coming up, deep cuts to the Pentagon and defense spending. And a lot of times between wars, so this happened after Vietnam as well, it's these kind of programs that get cut. Because, it's one thing to say, well, we've got a jet plant in our, in my congressional district, and that creates thousands of jobs, and we don't want to lose that. We tend to cut programs like this, and then we have to relearn all these lessons again the next time we go to war.
Did they have something like this in Vietnam?
Yeah, they actually did. They had a lot of experiments in Vietnam that were related to this. They had guys going in and interviewing like Viet Cong prisoners of war to try to figure out why they joined the VC, things like that. They learned some really important lessons during that war about how not to do this. I mean, there are some real serious ethical conflicts for anthropologists going into war. There are issues around intelligence gathering and the laws that cover that, as opposed to the laws that cover research on humans. And a lot of that stuff was ignored or just not looked at carefully enough when the human terrain system was built.
So we built it in Vietnam, let it die, and didn't learn anything from it, and then had to relearn it all again.
Essentially, yeah.
The book is called The Tender Soldier, a true story of war and sacrifice. Vanessa Gezari. Vanessa Gezari, you're going to be at the St. Louis County Library tonight, 7 p.m. for a book signing and a book reading. The book is called The Tender Soldier. Sounds fascinating. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much.
Any talk of a movie? Anybody talk to you about a movie?
I'd love to see one. And the one last thing I did want to say to folks before we go is, if you're not an expert on Afghanistan, you're not a policy wonk, don't worry. I would love to have a conversation with folks tonight who are just interested in Afghanistan. If you've ever asked yourself, what's going on over there? What are we doing over there? What's the point? I think this book might shed some light on that.
That is Vanessa Gezari. Close? Got it?
Yeah, you got it.
Hey, all right. Third time's charms. Vanessa Gezari. The book is The Tender Soldier. Bookstores everywhere, Amazon.com. Tonight, 7 p.m. for a book signing and a book reading. And you can, of course, buy it at the St. Louis County Library across the street from Brio on Lindbergh.